What happens when an unstoppable force meets immovable object? In 867 AD, Ragnar Lothbrok, the Viking who had never known defeat, launched his final campaign against Northumbria, but this time, his enemies were ready. This isn't just a story about a failed raid. This is about how the greatest Viking king in history made the worst tactical decision of his life, and how one moment of overconfidence changed the course of medieval Europe forever. By 867 AD, Ragnar Lothbrok had accomplished everything a Viking could dream of. He had terrorized the coasts of Europe for over 3 decades, accumulated wealth beyond kingdoms, and earned a reputation that made enemies surrender without fighting. But success had become his curse. At nearly 60 years old, the legendary king found himself trapped by his own legend, too famous to fade quietly, too proud to accept that his raiding days were behind him. The halls of Kattegat displayed the trophies of a lifetime of conquest: Frankish gold, English silver, treasures from monasteries across Europe. Each piece told a story of tactical genius, of impossible raids that had succeeded against overwhelming odds. But for Ragnar, these trophies had become reminders of what he used to be, rather than celebrations of what he had achieved. The problem with being legend is that legends don't retire. They either die gloriously or fade into irrelevance. And Ragnar Lothbrok had no intention of fading. In 867 AD, he would make a decision that proved even the greatest warriors can be undone by their own success. One last raid, one final conquest, one more chance to prove that Ragnar Lothbrok was still the most dangerous Viking alive. Vikings, if you want to witness how legends fall and destiny turns cruel, strike that red shield. Join Ragnar's final campaign and see how greatness became tragedy. Ragnar Lothbrok stood in his great hall, surrounded by the wealth of a dozen kingdoms, yet feeling poorer than he had as a young raider. His long, blonde, braided hair, now streaked with distinguished silver, caught the firelight as he studied maps that showed territories he had already conquered. The problem with achieving legendary status was that people expected miracles from you daily. Every young Viking wanted to prove himself against the famous Ragnar. Every enemy kingdom prepared specifically for his tactics. Every raid required more planning, more risk, more genius than the last. Success had made him predictable, and predictability was death for a Viking king. In the halls of Kattegat, younger warriors spoke in whispers about the aging king. They respected his achievements, but questioned whether his time had passed. Some openly suggested that fresh leadership might be needed for future campaigns. Ragnar heard these whispers, and they burned worse than any battlefield wound. He had spent his life proving that age and experience could triumph over youth and enthusiasm. But now, approaching 60, he felt the weight of years in ways that no amount of tactical genius could overcome. The young wolves were circling, and they smelled weakness. Perhaps most painful of all was watching his own sons achieve victories that rivaled his own legendary raids. Bjorn Ironside had conquered territories in the Mediterranean that Ragnar had never even attempted. Ivar the Boneless displayed tactical brilliance that sometimes exceeded even his father's genius. Each of his son's successes was simultaneously a source of pride and a reminder that the next generation was taking over. The student was becoming the master, and the master was being relegated to advisor status. Ragnar Lothbrok had become a living legend, emphasis on living. And living legends faced a choice: fade gracefully or prove they still belonged among the immortals. One kingdom had always escaped Ragnar's complete conquest: Northumbria. He had raided their coasts, burned their towns, and extracted tribute, but he had never achieved total domination of King Aelle's territory. This failure haunted him. Every other English kingdom had submitted to his authority at some point, but Northumbria remained defiant. King Aelle had proven surprisingly resilient, adapting his defenses to counter Viking tactics, learning from each raid to prepare for the next. For Ragnar, Northumbria represented unfinished business, the one conquest that would prove he still possessed the tactical genius that had made him legendary. Age should have brought wisdom, but success had brought pride instead. Ragnar convinced himself that one final decisive campaign against Northumbria would silence the whispers, intimidate the young wolves, and prove to his sons that the old king still possessed unmatched tactical genius. He began planning what he declared would be his masterpiece, a lightning raid that would finally bring King Aelle to heel and add Northumbria to his list of conquered territories. What he didn't realize was that King Aelle had been planning too, not just for defense, but for the opportunity to capture the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok alive. Ragnar's tactical planning, once meticulous and paranoid, became infected by overconfidence. He dismissed intelligence reports suggesting Aelle had strengthened his defenses. He ignored advice from experienced captains who warned that Northumbria felt like a trap. The same pride that had driven him to legendary achievements now clouded his judgment. He saw what he wanted to see, an aging enemy kingdom ripe for conquest by an experienced Viking king. He refused to see what was actually there, a carefully prepared trap designed specifically for him. For the first time in his career, Ragnar Lothbrok was about to underestimate his enemy. Against all conventional wisdom and the advice of his most experienced captains, Ragnar made a decision that would doom his campaign before it began. He would take only 2 ships to Northumbria. This wasn't tactical genius. This was ego overruling strategy. Ragnar convinced himself that a small force would prove his superiority more dramatically than a large army. 2 ships conquering what thousands had failed to achieve would cement his legendary status forever. His reasoning was fatally flawed, but his pride wouldn't let him see it. The warriors who volunteered for this minimal force expedition were mostly older Vikings who had sailed with Ragnar for decades. These weren't the young, aggressive raiders who filled most Viking crews. These were aging professionals whose best years were behind them. They joined not because they believed in the mission's success, but because they loved their king and couldn't bear to let him sail into danger alone. It was loyalty overcoming tactical sense, just as pride was overcoming Ragnar's strategic judgment. The crew that should have been his strength became another weakness in a campaign built on wishful thinking. Reports reached Kattegat suggesting that Northumbria had been unusually quiet lately. No raiding parties, no aggressive expansion, no visible military activity. To most tactical minds, this suggested preparation for defense or possibly a trap. Ragnar interpreted it as weakness. He convinced himself that Aelle's kingdom was declining, that the aging enemy king had lost his fighting spirit, that Northumbria was ripe for conquest by someone bold enough to take advantage. Every warning sign became, in Ragnar's mind, further evidence that now was the perfect time to strike. His legendary intuition had been corrupted by his need to prove himself still relevant. Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, and his other sons attempted to dissuade Ragnar from this campaign. They offered to lead the expedition themselves, suggested waiting for better intelligence, proposed larger forces for the assault, but their concern only strengthened Ragnar's resolve. Their attempts to protect him felt like confirmation that they saw him as too old, too weak, too past his prime to handle his own campaigns. The very love his sons showed him became additional motivation to prove them wrong, to demonstrate that the old king still possessed tactical genius beyond their comprehension. While Ragnar planned his minimal force assault, King Aelle had been preparing for years. The Northumbrian king had studied every Ragnar raid, analyzed every tactical pattern, and developed specific countermeasures for Viking assault techniques. More importantly, Aelle had been setting a trap. The apparent weakness of Northumbria was carefully orchestrated. Troops hidden, defenses reinforced secretly, intelligence networks feeding false information to Viking scouts. King Aelle knew that Ragnar's pride would eventually lead him into overconfidence, and he had prepared to exploit that weakness when the opportunity arose. Despite multiple bad omens, storms that delayed departure, equipment failures, crew members falling ill, Ragnar refused to postpone or cancel the expedition. Each setback only strengthened his determination to prove that superstition couldn't defeat tactical genius. The 2 ships that finally sailed from Kattegat carried not just warriors and supplies, but the accumulated pride, frustration, and desperate need for validation of a legendary king who refused to accept that his time might have passed. What should have been a strategic withdrawal became a voyage toward tragedy. The journey to Northumbria was cursed from the beginning. Storms that should have been seasonal squalls became supernatural tempests that battered the small fleet relentlessly. Winds that should have carried them swiftly to their destination instead drove them off course repeatedly. Ragnar's aging crew struggled with conditions that would have challenged younger, stronger warriors. Equipment failed, supplies were damaged, and morale plummeted as the voyage stretched far longer than planned. Every element seemed to be warning them to turn back, but Ragnar's pride interpreted each obstacle as a test of his determination. The loyal warriors who had volunteered for this expedition began exchanging worried glances as the voyage deteriorated. These were veterans who had survived decades of dangerous campaigns, and their experience told them this mission felt different. Cursed, doomed, wrong. But their loyalty to Ragnar prevented them from voicing their concerns. They had followed him through impossible campaigns before and emerged victorious. Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps their king's legendary genius would overcome the obvious problems. Their silence enabled Ragnar's self-deception when honest feedback might have saved them all. Ragnar's once supernatural navigation skills seemed compromised by age and overconfidence. Landmarks he had used for decades appeared different. Currents flowed in unexpected directions, and coastal features didn't match his memories. The aging king struggled with the possibility that his legendary seamanship might be declining, but his pride forced him to continue rather than admit uncertainty. Each navigation error compounded the expedition's problems while eroding the crew's confidence in their leader's abilities. For the first time in his career, Ragnar Lothbrok was sailing blind, both literally and figuratively. The sea itself seemed to be warning against this expedition. Unusual wave patterns suggested supernatural displeasure, bird behavior indicated approaching storms, and atmospheric conditions created omens that even experienced sailors couldn't ignore. Traditional Viking wisdom would have interpreted these signs as divine warnings to abandon the mission. But Ragnar had spent so many years defying conventional wisdom that he dismissed natural warnings along with human advice. His legendary ability to read the sea's moods had been corrupted by his need to prove that nothing, not age, not omens, not strategic sense, could stop Ragnar Lothbrok. Both ships began experiencing mechanical problems that shouldn't have occurred on vessels maintained by expert craftsmen. Rigging failed under normal stress, hulls developed leaks that required constant repair, and steering mechanisms became unreliable at critical moments. These weren't random equipment failures. They were symptoms of an expedition that had been poorly planned, inadequately prepared, and launched despite multiple warning signs. But Ragnar's pride transformed each problem into a challenge to be overcome rather than a reason to reconsider. The ships that should have been weapons became liabilities in a campaign that was becoming a disaster. As the Northumbrian coast finally appeared through the storm darkness, it seemed less like a destination than a death sentence. The rocky shores looked more forbidding than Ragnar remembered, the defensive positions more formidable, the entire landscape more hostile. But turning back now would mean admitting that the expedition had been a mistake, that his critics had been right, that age had indeed compromised his judgment. Ragnar's pride made retreat impossible, even when tactical sense demanded it. The Northumbrian coast approached like destiny itself, inevitable, dangerous, and final. The landing on Northumbrian shores seemed almost too easy. No defensive forces appeared to contest their arrival. No alarm horn sounded across the countryside. No resistance materialized to challenge the Viking assault. Ragnar's tactical instincts should have recognized this as suspicious, but his need for the mission to succeed overrode his strategic caution. He interpreted the lack of resistance as vindication of his strategy rather than evidence of a carefully prepared trap. The ease of landing wasn't a tactical advantage. It was bait in Aelle's carefully constructed snare. As the small Viking force moved inland, they encountered an unnaturally quiet landscape. Villages that should have been populated were strangely empty. Roads that should have carried traffic were deserted, and defensive positions that should have been manned were abandoned. Experienced warriors recognized this as the calm before the storm. But Ragnar convinced himself it was evidence of Northumbrian weakness. His legendary ability to read battlefield conditions had been compromised by his desperate need for validation. The silence wasn't surrender. It was the holding of breath before the trap snapped shut. The first Northumbrian attack came as a probing assault designed to test Viking strength rather than achieve decisive victory. Aelle's forces struck quickly, tested Ragnar's response capabilities, then withdrew before taking significant casualties. Ragnar's aging but experienced crew repelled this attack efficiently, and their success fed his overconfidence. He interpreted tactical withdrawal as defeat rather than strategic assessment, believing he had proven Viking superiority once again. But Aelle had learned what he needed to know. Ragnar's force was indeed minimal. His warriors were indeed aging, and his tactical responses were indeed predictable. While Ragnar celebrated his defensive success, Northumbrian forces were quietly surrounding his position. Using superior local knowledge in larger numbers, Aelle's troops systematically cut off Viking escape routes without engaging in direct confrontation. The same tactical genius that had made Ragnar legendary was being used against him by an enemy who had studied his methods for decades. Every move Ragnar made had been anticipated. Every strategy he employed had been countered in advance. For the first time in his career, Ragnar Lothbrok was being outthought by an enemy who understood his patterns better than he understood theirs. Aelle's forces systematically severed Ragnar's communications with his ships, preventing any possibility of naval escape or reinforcement. The small Viking force found itself isolated inland, cut off from their maritime advantages, trapped in terrain that favored defensive forces. Ragnar finally began to recognize the scope of Aelle's preparation, but his pride prevented him from acknowledging the full extent of his tactical error. Even facing encirclement, he convinced himself that Viking courage could overcome strategic disadvantage. The legendary king, who had built his reputation on superior planning, was about to discover the consequences of inadequate preparation. As dawn broke over the Northumbrian countryside, Ragnar's worst fears materialized. His tiny force was completely surrounded by overwhelming numbers of enemy troops. Aelle had transformed the entire region into a perfectly constructed trap. Every escape route was blocked, every strategic position occupied, every tactical advantage neutralized. The minimal force that was supposed to prove Ragnar's continued genius had instead demonstrated the fatal consequences of pride overcoming prudence. The trap that had been years in the making finally snapped shut around the legendary Viking king. Ragnar and his aging warriors fought with the desperation of men who knew they faced impossible odds. Their tactical skill and lifetime of experience enabled them to inflict casualties far exceeding their numbers, but skill couldn't overcome mathematical impossibility. Each Viking fought like 10 men, but they were facing hundreds. Each tactical maneuver delayed the inevitable, but couldn't prevent it. The legendary warriors who had conquered kingdoms found themselves overwhelmed by superior numbers and strategic preparation. The battle that should have been Ragnar's masterpiece became his funeral dirge. When Ragnar Lothbrok finally fell, wounded and exhausted, it marked the end of an era. The legendary king who had never known defeat was bound in chains by enemies who had studied him too well, planned too carefully, and waited too patiently. King Aelle's triumph was complete. He had captured the most famous Viking alive through superior strategy rather than superior force. The tactical genius had been outthought, the legendary warrior outmaneuvered, the aging king outplanned. The unstoppable force had finally met an immovable object, and the object had won. The aging warriors who had followed Ragnar on this doomed expedition died defending their captured king. Their loyalty cost them their lives, but they maintained Viking honor even in defeat, fighting to the last breath to protect the leader they had served for decades. Their sacrifice was both heroic and tragic. Heroic because they died as warriors. Tragic because they died for a mission that should never have been attempted. Their deaths would haunt Ragnar during his final captivity. The loyal crew who had trusted their king's judgment paid the ultimate price for his pride. King Aelle chose not to execute Ragnar immediately, recognizing that a living legendary prisoner was more valuable than a dead legendary enemy. The Northumbrian king wanted to savor his victory, to display his captive, to prove that Christian strategy could defeat pagan genius. This decision would prove fatally short-sighted. By keeping Ragnar alive, Aelle gave the Viking king time to send messages, to sing death songs, to prepare his sons for the revenge that would follow his inevitable execution. Tactical brilliance in capture would be followed by strategic stupidity in disposal. Before his execution, Ragnar managed to send a final message to his sons. The piglets would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffered. This cryptic communication carried both confession of his failure and promise of coming vengeance. The legendary king, who had made the worst tactical decision of his life, used his final moments to ensure that his death would trigger consequences far exceeding his capture. His last act of strategic genius was transforming personal failure into familial obligation. The aging king's pride had doomed his expedition, but his death would doom his enemies. As Ragnar prepared for the snake pit execution that would end his legendary life, he found peace in knowing that his death would accomplish what his final campaign could not. It would unite his sons in purpose, mobilize the largest Viking army in history, and bring destruction to Northumbria beyond anything a successful raid could have achieved. The expedition that had failed tactically would succeed strategically through the revenge it would inspire. The king who had lost his final battle would win his ultimate war through the consequences of his death. Sometimes legends fall so that greater legends can rise. Ragnar's final campaign became a cautionary tale that would influence Viking strategic thinking for generations. The expedition demonstrated that even legendary genius could be corrupted by pride, that tactical excellence required strategic humility, and that past success guaranteed nothing about future performance. The aging king's failure taught lessons more valuable than his victories, that knowing when to stop was as important as knowing when to start, that recognizing limitations was wisdom rather than weakness. Ragnar's tactical failure became his son's strategic inheritance. His death would mobilize the great heathen army, unite Viking factions in common purpose, and create the largest invasion force medieval Europe had ever seen. The expedition that failed to conquer Northumbria would inspire a campaign that conquered much of England. The king who died in defeat would be avenged by sons who achieved victories exceeding his greatest triumphs. Ragnar Lothbrok's final campaign failure didn't diminish his legendary status. It completed it. The king who had achieved everything learned to accept mortality. The warrior who had never lost discovered the price of overconfidence. The legend who had seemed immortal proved his humanity. From the tragedy of his final expedition emerged the truth that even legends must fall, but in falling greatly, they inspire others to rise even higher. Ragnar's last raid failed, but his eternal legacy succeeded beyond anything mere conquest could have achieved. In the halls of Valhalla, even the gods acknowledged that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most devastating defeats.